Yesterday we talked about what would happen if the Winnipeg Jets, say, tore it all down, but we all know that Winnipeg is generally not want to use the rebuild word. So, what happens if the Jets just ran it back? How would this team look, and could they do anything to make this roster even better than it already is? We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so is completely free of charge and ensures everydayers never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Now, like I said, tonight's episode is going to be focused on, envisioning another scenario that is actually more likely than the Jets rebuilding it and tearing it down. What happens if the Jets maintain status quo and look to come back with mostly what they had this season under Rick Bowness? Before we go any further, though, I want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Stay tuned later this episode to hear more about how Gametime can save you time and money when you are buying tickets. Now, the Jets running it back is not exactly the most appetizing topic of discussion, right? We're all sort of tired of this Jets team to some degree. I think even the most diehard rabid fans look at this Jets franchise and all they can think of is, stagnancy and frankly disappointment. Everything since 2017, 2018 really hasn't hit the mark for what we were hoping. I think the first half of the season, I felt very differently. I was excited. I was really engaged. I thought the Jets were actually pretty darn good, but things definitely faded in the second half. Bones kind of lost control of the situation to a degree, not entirely his own doing. I mean, this team just doesn't have the offensive depth to compensate for, at times, how bad the finishing is. And if Hellebuyck is even like a little bit mediocre, suddenly you find yourself on the wrong end of a lot of very bad score lines, which the Jets in that second half, with how many games they lost and how poorly they performed, it's not surprising that Winnipeg really struggled to make the postseason. But all is not lost. There are ways for the Jets to kind of work around this. Now, I would prefer that the Jets kind of retool and rebuild, especially because the contract situations are going to force them to make a decision sooner rather than later, and probably at the latest at the trade deadline next season. But assuming that the Jets really feel they can come back next season with most of what they have, what is this team going to look like? For one thing, I still don't see a future with Pierre-Luc Dubois staying for at least another season. I just feel like, in this case, Winnipeg probably understands his feelings and understands the situation. I would imagine that with him reportedly not being dead set on going to Montreal and being open to other options, they are looking to maybe open up a bidding war for Dubois' services. And who wouldn't want a really good top six center? For all of Dubois' faults, and he does have a number of them, he's still a dominant playmaking creative force when he's on his game. And so many teams could use that really strong physical presence in their top six, who's also not a slouch offensively. When it comes to attacking the slot area and creating great passing lanes and doing a lot of the work down low, Dubois is still elite, and he's also got a ridiculous shot. So for me, right, I still think he goes to the Habs. I feel like that remains the most natural destination. And in return, the Jets would probably get a package including Kirby Dach. Now, Dach as your second-line center or winger really wouldn't be terrible. I'm not a huge fan of Dach personally. I think that he has taken steps forward since departing the Chicago Blackhawks, but I don't look at his numbers and on-ice results and think that this is a guy as it is right now, who is likely to replace the full impact of Dubois. Do I think Doc has the potential to be really good down the road? Yeah, probably. I think that he has kind of stepped out of the shadows of some of the players who were kind of elevating his game, and he's changed his own performance to drive more results than he used to. But I still feel like Doc has a bit of a ways to go before I'd really want to entrust a lot of high-end second-line minutes to him. But maybe moving to Winnipeg would be a good shift for his career. I don't know. Winnipeg would probably like him because he's 6'4", big, strong scorer with a pretty decent release, good passing, and pretty good skating. So I could see them looking at that plus his age at 22 being very young, which means that if he was to develop and improve, you'd probably have him as part of your future core. So I do see a lot of congruencies there in terms of trade alignments. Would Doc be the kind of player that you want to run it back with next season? I don't know. If you're going from Dubois to Doc, I do think you're going to see a noticeable drop-off in offensive performance on whatever line Doc would be stepping in for. If it's like the third line, obviously he'd boost the scoring there, but you're going to notice Dubois' absence in the top six, and that is something that you can't easily replace. There's just not many free agent options that are going to do the same level of work that Dubois has done for this team, even when he still has those mediocre outings. The issues with Dubois when it comes to effort, or maybe not aggressively backchecking, or occasionally turning over the puck in a very lazy display, that stuff hasn't necessarily held him back enough from still being a really influential force on the ice. So yeah, I could imagine that it is going to be a step back. I think the Jets would have to supplement this lineup with additional signings, and this free agent market's not going to be great, but I think there are ways to go around it where you could potentially spend some cash and get a reasonable return. I don't know how much the Jets are really budgeting for free agency, but if you're intent on running it back for at least one more season with most of the team that you have, you're going to have to do something. We'll talk about what those somethings are and how the Jets can try and at least make this team a little bit more palatable. It's not going to be ideal. I think we all know that, generally speaking, whatever the Jets are going to do here, it's going to be a little on the middling side. I think we know that Winnipeg traditionally approaches free agency with a lot of hesitancy, but we'll still try and come up with something that at least gives this team some reinforcements within a reasonable budget. Now, before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. There is no I in team, but there is one Indeed, and that's the hiring platform you need to build your superstar team. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is fantastic because it helps save you tons of hours and time searching for candidates by finding a ton of great applicants where you can attract, interview, and hire them all in one convenient place. Best of all, 80% of employers get quality candidates when they use Instant Match. This is a great service which allows you to identify candidates who better match your specific job requirements and qualifications. And for a lot of you who probably have tons of job listings out there, you know how long it can take to find the one applicant who really satisfies those conditions. Indeed takes a lot of that out of the equation and helps you find candidates who are 3 times more likely to apply to your job listing when using Instant Match. And best of all, they always give you quality candidates. They filter out a lot of the folks who aren't going to meet your needs because they want to make sure that your superstar team is up to championship caliber. Even better, Indeed's the only job site where you only pay for applicants that meet your must-have requirements. So, if you want to get started hiring right now, you can get a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job posting at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offer good for a limited time. Again, claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/lockedon. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are obviously talking on this episode about what if the Jets just ran it back next year, right? Now, they can't run it back entirely because there are some situations and scenarios with some players that, quite frankly, the Jets aren't just going to be able to avoid. So I think, they are going to cut bait with guys like Dubois. I think that trade is likely to happen this summer. With Scheifele, I don't know. Scheifele has been really non-committal over the past couple of years about his future with this team, and something happened this season where he went from being one of the biggest game changers on the Jets to looking like he just did not care. That second half of the season, when he kind of took a bit of a step back from his first half performance, really said to me that something changed, either the messaging or how he interpreted the messaging, and he didn't really feel the belief or necessarily agree with the direction of the team going forward. And I feel like that definitely showed until the playoffs when he kind of looked re-energized again. And then, of course, he breaks, his shoulder or whatever. So obviously not a very good situation to finally get him back and up and running again out at wing, only to lose him again in a critical series. So Scheifele, very interesting question. Let's just assume that he comes back. Wheeler, I kind of don't know if he's considering retiring, and I know people will say, oh, he's going to leave all this money on the table. Sometimes when you have really rich athletes at this stage of their career, there are other pressing concerns, like the fact that, your quality of life is occasionally going to decline once you retire. And so it's really important to make the most of the time that you have with your family and kids. And Wheeler's only got 1 year left. I don't know if the insurance policy would cover lost wages if, in fact, he does retire. I'm sure that there are some clauses for that. But assuming that Blake does step away from the game, that would mean that the Jets not only have a major winger spot, but also a reasonable amount of cap space to work with. And if you're trying to make this team better and deeper, this is a really good opportunity to bring in some reinforcements who, look, they're not going to change your team entirely, but just having more scoring depth up and down the lineup can have a world of difference for a team that, last year was very top six reliant for scoring and didn't have a bottom six that could necessarily get it done. So if you're chasing like a major free agent, let's go with Jason Zucker. I've mentioned Zucker before, but I feel like when it comes to wingers who can actually be positive difference makers on the ice and who would actually be reasonable scorers and also move the needle for the Jets, Zucker would be a player that I think checks off all of the boxes. I know that he has some very clear reputation issues with like finishing, but look, in terms of what the Jets need, a guy who can be a creative playmaking force, who's not half bad in transition, and generally puts up, middle, like, or not middle six, but probably like second line numbers. I feel like you could do a lot worse than Zucker. He was being paid $5.5 million this season. Have to imagine that he's probably getting something not far off from there on his next deal, unless somebody really gives him a huge contract, but I don't know that that's the case. I wonder if you could get him at around 4.75 or something. If you can do that, I think that's a great value contract. If you really want to chase big fish and really change kind of the landscape for this team, you could try and go after Jesper Bratt. You will have to trade some assets, and Bratt would be very interesting, but he's also due for a pretty huge raise. And I get the sense the Jets are trying to avoid committing tons of money into long-term contracts. I feel like the Jets are probably preparing to turn this roster over in the next year or two. So for me, Bratt would be like a really dreamlike scenario, but unlikely to be the kind of player that A, even wants to sign in Winnipeg long-term, and B, that the Jets would really spend assets to try and chase if they can't really guarantee that they can retain him long-term. Kind of on the topic of players who might be better for the short term, Thomas Tatar would be fantastic. Tatar is super underrated. I don't know what his next deal would look like. He's being paid like $4.5 million this year. If you were to get him and Zucker for around the combined cap hit of what Wheeler is, maybe just a little bit over, I think that would be a fantastic use of the space. Obviously, people are going to look at this and say, well, they're both like, 45, 50-point players. Wheeler had that much in one season a couple of years ago. But in terms of what they can offer this team's offensive creation and how to balance Winnipeg's lineups, plus throwing in some ELCs in between, I think this is a better approach to trying to make this team deeper, right? That's the main thing. You want three lines that you can match up against most other opponents, top nine configurations, because like most contenders who have a lot of speed and a lot of skill, they all win those matchup battles against the Jets, especially when it comes to the depth lines. Winnipeg's top six usually gets pasted, and then the bottom six is trying to pick up the scraps, and it doesn't often go well. So this approach is designed to try and give the Jets more overall depth and skill with players who might be on the older side, might not be committed for the long term. But if you're trying to make one last season, one last go of it for one more year, this might be your best shot at doing so. And again, it really depends on how Winnipeg is going to approach the wage bill this year. I don't know that they're really interested in spending a lot of cash. My guess is all of what I'm saying is going to be for naught because the Jets are going to go, going to go really cheap. And if they're doing that, you might as well just sort of throw all caution to the wind and sign as many fourth liners as you can because Winnipeg's not going to be spending much, right? But I don't know. We're not really getting a clear, consistent vision from this team, and I guess that's one of the big questions with the Jets going forward is, what is the plan for the Jets? How do you want to remain competitive and run it back if you can't even tell us where you're getting the money from and how you're going to be using it? So a lot of assumptions being made on my behalf, and certainly me trying to project here, but we're trying to find something that gives at least a little bit of hope if the Jets try and return next season. Now, there are some other players who might be able to help Winnipeg, and we'll dive into who those players might be and if it's really worth spending cash for their services. But before we go any further, I want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful, and it shouldn't be as expensive as it is, but a lot of you are probably used to paying an arm and a leg for all the concerts, sports events, and music shows that you like to go to. I personally attend a lot of concerts, until recently, of course. Apologies for that joke, but you're probably looking for ways to save money, and Gametime can help you find killer last-minute deals and last-minute tickets on a lot of stuff that folks are clearing out for bargain bin prices. Instead of spending money months in advance for tickets that might be way overpriced, check out their flash deals and last-minute ticket deals that can help save you a ton of money and also offer you in-arena or in-venue seat views so you know what you're buying into. A lot of you have probably seen the infamous obstructed views at Fenway. This is a great way to avoid buying those tickets if you don't want that experience. Maybe some of you are crazy and you like having a giant pillar in front of you while you're trying to watch a game. I personally like to see what I'm actually watching and paying for. So this is why Gametime is awesome. I think they offer great opportunities to get great tickets and deals and seats, most importantly. And again, if you find somewhere else that has a better price, Gametime guarantee offers you a 110% credit for a cheaper ticket if you manage to find one that's at a better value than what you paid. And of course, you will have your tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're set with the app. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create and redeem an account at Locked On or with promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. Every day, we're just wrapping up really quickly with some maybe final free agent acquisitions the Jets could be interested in if they start cutting salary and looking to save some cash. Maybe looking for some players who, I don't know, I guess help them move the needle a bit and at least, if not move the needle, maintain status quo. Not exactly the most enticing thought process, if I'm being honest, but, it is what it is. I guess if you're looking for, value players who could be relatively cheap without killing the budget, Alex Kerfoot might be an option for, $3.5 million. You give him a Lowry contract, he's probably a 30 to 40 point guy. Could maybe eat up some, PK minutes, not that I would necessarily trust him with a lot of that, but Kerfoot has traditionally been a very solid middle six forward. Not somebody that I would want to use in a top six deployment. I think he's the kind of player who also, for me, maybe blocks a spot for a David Gustafsson to step up or some of those other prospects that the Jets have internally. But he's also still productive enough to where if he were to take up one of those spots, I wouldn't complain. I just wonder, how much would he realistically bring for the price tag that he's likely to incur? Other guys that you could maybe take a swing at, Pius Suter would be interesting. Suter spent some time overseas recently and has come back to North America, from what I understand. He was very productive in 5v5 play when he was playing in North America, and I believe what was his last stint? Either the Red Wings or the Sabres. But Suter, when he was playing for both of those teams, was actually like just a legitimately good middle six winger, and somebody that I think the Jets could quite honestly get some value out of. He's also played down the middle, so if you like having a versatile center who can do whatever it is that you ask of him and generally drive play at 5v5, Suter would be a really good value option. You'd probably be able to sign him for less than $3 million, and I'm sure plenty of teams are already lining up to give him a contract offer. That's just my guess, because it feels like he is primed for a breakout season. He's also 26, so relatively speaking, at a pretty young age, that you could get a couple of prime seasons left out of him. Other than that, if you want to take some swings, there's Puljujärvi, Denis Gurianov, not really players in RFAs that I think are super exciting. Puljujärvi would be interesting if the Jets are looking for a guy who can drive transition. Unfortunately, the finishing part of his game still is kind of missing. And Puljujärvi would probably fit under the category of players who are good at what they do, but don't bring enough to necessarily move Winnipeg's needle for our biggest need right now, which is finishing talent. But hey, if you're looking to try and spruce up that bottom six with a jazzy signing that looks better on paper than it probably is for Winnipeg's overall, change in direction, Puljujärvi or players of his caliber probably satisfy Winnipeg's requirement of doing something to make it look like you're progressing. But I'm not going to complain about it. I think that's kind of where I'm at with this team. If they try and run it back, I mean, there's obviously a lot of consequences and things that I've talked about in the past, and reasons why I'm not a fan of that move, but I get it for the Jets, right? I know how they operate financially. They've been very transparent that attendance hasn't been where they need it to be, and they're hurting for some operating funds. So if they bring the gang back together, let's just hope that for once they actually have a really active offseason and try and improve this team, because as it is, it's just not deep enough to go the distance throughout either the whole regular season or the postseason. Let me know what major free agent transactions or trades you would want the Jets to make. Drop your comments and thoughts below in the YouTube section or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_ on Twitter. But on LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. But for tonight's show, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. Everydayers can tune in tomorrow to hear some thoughts about either Brad Lambert's upcoming series against the Winnipeg Ice, or maybe even some thoughts ahead of the upcoming draft where the Jets, maybe we've talked about them potentially trading back. Who could they get if they move back 5-6 slots? Would there be anyone in the second round worth scouting out? We'll try and figure that out on tomorrow night's episode. But like I said, for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day. We will see you here tomorrow. And as always, go Jets go.